All right, crew, chapter 9 of The Great Divorce. The most theologically dense chapter of the book, this in chapter 11. So if you're like, what's going on? You're in good company. I'm going to try and break it down a little bit so that you can understand it a little bit better. The premise of this lecture is that we all have two choices and that there's only two types of people. All right, so I want you to think in terms of twos right here. Two choices, two types of people, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. So a quick recap so far. We've been faced with a bunch of characters. We've seen some solid people. We've seen some ghosts. Mostly we focus on who the ghosts are, though. And they all have something that they want out of heaven and something that they're unwilling to give up to stay. So for the poet, chapter 2, he specifically says, what I want out of the high countries is I want recognition and appreciation. I want my art and my work to be seen, to be appreciated. And we don't follow him down to the fullest, but we can assume that heaven's not going to be like, oh my gosh, you've earned your way here because you're such a good poet. Welcome, right? So he's going to be disappointed. He's probably going to go back. Chapter 3, we see the big man who does go back. And he's the one who says, I want my rights. I don't want any sort of charity. I want what I have earned. Give me what I have earned. And his friend says, no, you don't, because we've all earned hell. You want the bleeding charity. And he says, nope, I don't take anybody's charity. I'm too proud for that. Decides to go back. The bishop in chapter 5, he's the one that really resonated with me. He's the seeker, but sometimes he's a seeker who doesn't actually want answers, right? He's a seeker who his seeking has sort of festered. And so the solid person says, hey, you have to become like a child. You have to ask questions with the purpose of getting answers. And he says, great mysteries shouldn't be dabbled in that way. I'm going to go back and I'm going to keep probing the mysteries. I'm going to keep trying to figure out little bits and pieces. And so he doesn't actually want answers, refuses to give up his seeking and his questioning, goes back to hell to do that. Ike, he's the apple ghost. He's the one who wants to take a little bit of heaven to go back to hell, make a quick buck. He finds out that heaven and hell are a great divorce. They do not mix at all. And the ghost says, you can't even take a little bit of heaven back into hell. So he leaves disappointed. The hard-bitten ghost, he's the one who's a skeptic, says it's all a sham. No one can actually stay. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. They got you. And he refuses to stay because he wants to be proven right. He wants to find out that, hey, you were right. It is all a sham, right? He doesn't want to risk actually potentially being wrong. So he stays. And then lastly, we get the frightened ghost. I think that was chapter maybe 8. Yeah, chapter 8. She's the one who is ashamed. There's something about, she doesn't want her inner parts to be seen. She's ashamed of who she is, and so she decides to go back. We now get George MacDonald talking to C.S. Lewis. George MacDonald, my favorite author far and away. I think he gets life in so many different ways. But in chapter 9, and Robert Downs actually alluded to this, he said, is C.S. Lewis going to have a person to meet him at the bus stop? And it's George MacDonald. And so we get to see that. It's great. If we could add Tolkien to this, it would be like the coolest conversation in the world. But Lewis, or the character of C.S. Lewis, has seen all these different ghosts. He's seen so many of them choose to go back to the gray town. And so he approaches George MacDonald, recognizes him, because in C.S. Lewis's real life, he considered George MacDonald his inspiration, his master in a way. And he asked George MacDonald, he says, can the ghosts really stay? Can they actually choose to stay in the high countries instead of go back to the gray town? Is that actually a possibility? Because I've seen a bunch of ghosts already, and they've all gone back. Can they actually stay? And George MacDonald answers very simply, it's their choice. He says, this is the valley of the shadow of life and the valley of the shadow of death. Really, it's the beginning of hell or heaven. Okay, I'm going to try and break this down, so stay with me. First off, very simply, he says, it's their choice. Directly answers the question, can the ghosts stay? Yes, they can. It is their choice of whether they want to live in the valley of the shadow of life, the high countries, or the valley of the shadow of death, which is the gray town. And then he says, really, it's the beginning of hell or heaven. Now, this is where it's a little bit confusing. So I want you to flip back to the chart that you should have somewhere in the beginning of your book. It'll look like this. And I want you to flip back to that chart, because what we're going to do is I want you guys to see that really he's just saying the same thing that we've been saying, just in a slightly different way. So we have the gray town, which is a sort of twilight, right? An in-between period that will eventually fade into night at the end times. And we have the high countries, which is a sort of twilight or an in-between period that will eventually fade into day at the end of times. And I want you to add to that chart, under the twilight for the gray town, I want you to write valley of the shadow of death. And then under the twilight in the high countries, I want you to write valley of the shadow of life. And what I want you guys to see is that a valley, just like a twilight, is a sort of in-between period, right? A valley is when you're approaching a mountain, but you haven't yet reached the mountain. And so what George MacDonald says is really the same thing that we've been talking about with this chart, is that our decision on earth is that we all live in a sort of in-between, a twilight. But is it the valley of the shadow of death? Is there twilight that fades to night? Or is it the valley of the shadow of life? Is there twilight that fades to day? Are we living in a valley that will descend into a pit? Or are we living in a valley that will ascend into a mountain? And so really we're getting the same image, just in different ways. But then he says the confusing part at the end. He says, really, it's the beginning of hell or heaven. And so C.S. Lewis then asked a question that probably all of you are asking. He says, what do you mean by that? Right? What do you mean that this is the beginning of hell or heaven? No, this is earth, or this is purgatory, right? He says this is the in-between. It's not the beginning of it. And MacDonald says this. He says, let me get my pen real quick because I have to add something to it. He says, at the end of times, when the sun rises here and the twilight turns to blackness down there, the blessed will say, we have never lived anywhere except heaven. And the lost will say, we were always in hell. So read that again. Make sure you annotate that. That's on page 69. It's the last kind of couple sentences. And at the end of all things, when the sun rises here, so when the twilight becomes day, and the twilight turns to blackness down there, when the twilight becomes night, the blessed, the saved, the solid people will say, we have never lived anywhere except heaven. And the lost, or the damned, will say, we were always in hell. So this is a little confusing because it makes it sound like that earth right now is either heaven or hell, or purgatory, if there's such a thing, is either heaven or hell. And it's like, no, it's actually not. But in a way, he's on to something. And I want to show you a diagram that I think will help you clarify that. Let's say that heaven and hell are two different books, that heaven is a book and that hell is another book. And let's say that we're all reading the introduction to the book. So when you're reading an introduction to the book, you haven't actually started the story. The story doesn't start until chapter 1. And so when you're reading the introduction to a book, let's say you have two books. You got hell, you got heaven, and I'm reading the introduction to both of them. And let's say I'm reading the introduction to the book on heaven, and I'm like, oh, this is, it's not that interesting. I think I want to switch books. I can switch books, right? And so I start reading the introduction to the book on hell. I'm like, oh, this sounds a little bit cooler. Or let's say it's the other way around. I'm reading the introduction to the book on hell. I'm like, I'm not really feeling it. I switch books. I start reading the introduction to the book on heaven. And I'm like, this sounds like a cool story. Once you start the story, though, you have to finish, right? Like all readers know, you can't just put a book down in the middle. Once the story starts, that's the book you're reading. And so really what MacDonald is saying is that earth, in a sense, is the introduction. It's the very beginning where we can choose which book we want to read, right? I can choose whichever introduction seems the most interesting to me, seems to offer the most. I'll read that book. And so a lot of people will say, hey, this book on hell seems more interesting than what heaven has to offer me, right? They go to church, whatever, and they're like, it's not doing it for me. This book on hell, what it seems to offer is going to be better. And then they decide to read. Once they die, they've started chapter 1, and there's no going back, right? They're now in this book till the end. Or they could say, you know what, this just doesn't seem that great. I'm dissatisfied, like Qoheleth and Ecclesiastes. I want to switch books. And they start reading the introduction. They're like, this seems good. They die, they start chapter 1, and they're in it till the end. And so what he's saying here is that when we look back, we'll realize that our time on earth was really just the introduction to the story. That our time on earth will be such a little tiny blip when seen in the picture of reality that we'll say, oh, remember, I'm reading the book on heaven. You know, I'm in heaven now. I see the full picture. I now realize that I was always reading the introduction to that book. That I was, in a way, like, and this, you know, I'm not trying to sound heretical, but it's like this is the beginning stages of heaven, right? Life on earth for the believer is the introduction to the book on heaven. And he says, and for the lost will say, we were always in hell. They'll look back on their time on earth and say, I was always reading the introduction to the book on hell, and now I've started it, and I understand that. And so he says it's almost like earth is just the beginning part of heaven or hell, depending on which introduction we're reading. And it's all the same way to say this, right? It's the twilight that fades into night. Twilight is kind of a part of night. The morning twilight is kind of a part of the day. And so really, we'll look back and we'll see the full picture. We'll understand that earth was that beginning stage. And then C.S. Lewis, still a little bit confused, says, well, what'll happen then? And George MacDonald answers him and says, the lost will make excuses, and the saved will look back and see the full picture. So once we start the story, once it becomes night and day, once the valley becomes a mountain or a pit, the lost will look back and make excuses. And if you look at the top of page 71, that first paragraph, he gives a list of different excuses, right? He says some will say, well, I was a good person. Some will say, at least I was true to myself and I followed my true beliefs. Some will say, I gave everything I had into my work on earth, right? We'll all make excuses. And it reminds me of these ghosts, right? They all have something that they're going to make excuses about. Well, I did this or I did this. But he says the saved will look back and they'll understand the full picture. It reminds me of the line from Leaf by Niggle where, I'm not sure if it's Parrish or Niggle, but one of them says, it could have been different, but it couldn't have been better, right? We'll look back and we'll see that even though the introduction to the story took some ups and downs, it was still in the book on heaven. That even though our lives were confusing and there was depression and anxiety and death and hurt and confusion and all of those things, that we were still in the right book. And that we were just in the introduction. Now we've started the story where we will be for eternity. So then Lewis actually asked the question that I think everyone who reads The Great Divorce struggles with. Do we actually have a choice after death? Is this the way that Mr. Harvey's interpreting it, which is that this is life on earth, or is it actually a story about purgatory where we choose after we die? And George MacDonald leaves us with this. He says, you cannot fully understand the relations of choice and time until you are beyond both. He says, that's not for you to worry about because we can't figure it out. He says, you were not brought here to study such curiosities. What concerns you is the nature of the choice itself. And the choice is, and on page 71, make sure you annotate this. Do we want to reign in hell or do we want to serve in heaven? Right? Do we want to be kings and rulers of ourselves in hell, like all of these ghosts have chosen, right? He wants his rights. He wants recognition. He wants his questions. He wants financial gain, right? They want to rule over these things. They want to control their own destiny. Or do we want to completely give it up and be a servant in heaven, right? Which twilight do you want to live in? Which introduction are you reading to which book? Which valley are you living in? Right? We're all in that in-between stage of it all comes down to this choice. And so the reason that I've depicted it as life on earth is because I don't know if there's some sort of purgatory afterward. I don't know if there's some sort of shallow heaven and shallow hell. What I do know is that we're all living in an in-between stage right now, that we're all living in a twilight, that we're all living in a valley. And now is when we have the choice. And that I'm sure of. And so that's why I believe that this is how we should interpret the book. Is he says, you weren't brought here to study such curiosities. You were brought to study that we all have a choice. And that choice is, do we want to reign in hell or do we want to serve in heaven? Lastly, C.S. Lewis asked a really difficult question, one that I think every thinking Christian has asked. And that is, what about the lost? What about those who never make it to the high countries, right? Were they screwed from the beginning? And that's just a tough question. And I think it's a beautiful answer that MacDonald gives. He says, everyone who wishes to stay can stay. Right? He doesn't go into a ton of in and outs. He doesn't, he doesn't reference scripture. Just quite simply, I mean, he does reference scripture, but it's implied. Quite simply, he says, everyone who wishes to stay can stay. And then he says there are only two kinds of people in the end. And he says the two types of people are those who say to God, thy will be done, or those to whom God says, thy will be done. Someone is saying, thy will be done. Let me explain this. Either we are looking at God and saying, God, I have all these things I want. I want my rights. I want to be popular. I want to be seen as a great poet, a great writer, a great basketball player, whatever. But I'm going to give it all up because I want to serve in heaven instead of reign in hell. So your will be done. Do with me whatever you will. Or we say, you know what? I want to be the master of my own fate. I want to keep this sin pattern. I want to keep this lifestyle. I want to keep this whatever it is. And God will look at you and say, all right, your will be done. If you think that's going to make you happy, do it. Right? And that's the choice that we have. And so MacDonald leaves us with that. He says, really, there's two choices. Do we want to reign in hell or serve in heaven? And there's two types of people. Either we are saying to God, thy will be done, or God is saying to me, you know what, Luke? Your will be done, man. If you don't want me, go your own way. And so someone is saying that phrase. And so where I want to leave us is this last quote from George MacDonald. He says, it's kind of a purpose of life quote. He says, every one of us lives only to journey further and further into the mountains, which is just like in Leaf by Niggle. But the question is, which mountains? We're either in the valley of the shadow of life, right, traveling into the mountains of deep heaven, or we're in the valley of the shadow of death, which is soon going to drop off into a pit of deep hell. We're all in a twilight that is either going to become day or it's going to become night. We're all in an introduction that's either going to become chapter 1 of the book on heaven or it's going to become chapter 1 of the book on hell. 3 different ways to say the same thing. Every one of us lives only, here's our purpose, to journey further and further into the mountains. And the choice that we are presented with is which mountains? Do we say thy will be done to God, or does God say that to us? And so that's kind of where we're going to leave off with chapter 9.